Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young, licensed clinical social worker. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. I am really excited about this episode with Anya Surnitsky. We're talking about childhood emotional neglect, CEN, and how wounding affects connection. This is part one of a two-part episode, and in this episode, we talk about attachment. What is it? We use Brene Brown's work to talk about security and safety and how we get our needs met, and how to survive when our needs aren't being met. Really, what we all want is to be seen and heard and feel valued. And what happens is oftentimes we get triggered due to childhood neglect and trauma, and that creates conflict in our relationships. We talk about the three ways that Brene Brown talks about how we break shame, which is, in order for shame to survive, it needs secrecy, silence, and judgment. The antidote to shame is empathy. Just somebody being able to say, I hear ya, I get it. It is hard. It sucks. We also talk about we don't want to be fearless. Fear is healthy. We don't want fear to hold us back, but we do want to have some fear because it advises us of where danger and where we need to be cautious. We talk about knowing our shame triggers, and Anya gives us some great tools for when we get triggered. What are the things that we can do to work with that triggering? We talk about getting into our reptilian brain, which is what I call our T-Rex brain, where we kind of want to get out, we want to fight, or we want to play dead. And when we're in our T-Rex brain, we really don't have the skills to communicate. We kind of need to get back into our frontal lobe, where we've got a little bit more logic and reasoning. But I love that Anya gives us some great examples. And we talk about the story that we make up in our head and how we can use that to start breaking the shame and to have some vulnerability, which creates safety in our relationships. It's really an amazing episode. I really hope that you enjoy it. I just want to give you a teaser. I'm collaborating with another therapist, and pretty soon we're going to be offering some online groups for highly sensitive people. We'll have some more information coming up for you in future episodes, but I just want to give you a little bit of a tease about that. So let me tell you a little bit about Anya Surnitsky. Anya Surnitsky is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice outside Philadelphia. She helps anxious high achievers and overgivers with big wounded hearts to transform their pain into power and avoidance into action. Anya uses her training in EMDR, ego state therapy, and childhood emotional neglect, as well as her certification in the Daring Way, to aid clients in making peace with the past, embrace the present, and develop confidence for the future. Anya is passionate about educating clients on how trauma and/or neglect affects the developing brain to understand how unhealed wounds from the past show up in the present and can have a negative impact on their future. Throughout her personal and professional journey, Anya has learned that what people want more than anything is to be seen and heard for who they are at their core. For our listeners, Anya has put together some scripts for hard conversations to help HSPs ask to be heard and dare to be seen in their relationships. And you can go to www.couragecompassiontherapy.com/HSP. And now, on to the show. Hey, Anya, welcome.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to have this conversation today. I've gotten such great feedback from the listeners about how much they want to know more about childhood emotional neglect and then talking about wounding and connection and trust. I just think this is going to be an amazing conversation.
Awesome.
Do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
So I took the test twice because I thought that I did, but I actually don't. But I was reading and it was like, but if you really identify with some of these traits, then, maybe you do. And so I find that I'm really sensitive to like loud noises and crowds, and I pick up on people's energies, but I don't think I'm all the way there. So I think I have some traits of an HSP, and I don't know if you can become an HSP But I feel like as I've been doing more work and, advancing in my clinical skills, I just feel more HSP, I guess, than I did maybe 10 years ago, if that makes sense.
Sure. And being a highly sensitive person, it's an innate trait. So it's something that you're born with. However, if we're raised in environments where our parents or caregivers were not responsive, we learn to bury those traits. And for the people that have been listening for a while, when I was 30, I went into a recovery home for treatment for my eating disorder. And in the morning, we had to do a feelings check-in. I couldn't even tell you what a feeling was because in my family growing up, we didn't talk about feelings. So it's not uncommon for people to be highly sensitive people and to maybe not even know it because for survival, they had to bury those traits.
Sure. Shut them down. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Let's get going because I'm excited.
Okay.
So let's start out with Brene Brown's work. And can you talk a little bit about how we're wired for survival and connection?
Sure. This has been coming up a lot lately in my practice. We are wired for both survival and connection. And Brene Brown's work is about understanding how we're wired for connection and what gets in the way of that. The system that makes us wired for connection is, it comes from us being mammals and the need for nurturing and attachment. And I know that attachment has been discussed on your podcast before.
Actually, I'm going to stop you for just a second. Can we talk about what attachment means in a way that somebody that has never heard that can get what that means?
Sure. So I don't have a definition in front of me, so I'm totally going to wing it.
I like it that way.
Okay. So think about a mom and a baby and other animals who nurture their young. And there's closeness, the physical closeness after a baby's born, like the physical touch, the skin to skin contact, that's part of it. And that helps our that helps our nervous system start to regulate. So we feel calm, we feel soothed, like we're not alone because we're not able to care for ourselves as babies. So we need that parent, that parental figure, and we need them for a long time as humans. And so if our parent or caregiver goes away, and we don't know if they're coming back or they come back and they're hostile or, there's a lot of confusion and wounding that happens. That affects our attachment. That affects how we understand how we get connected with other people, how other people may perceive us, and then all of the reactions that kind of like a domino effect go from there.
Okay, so my understanding, and this is a working definition, is attachment has to do with security. A baby's hungry, they cry, they get their need met. They end up learning that the world is a safe place and it's okay to have needs because somebody's going to respond to them. But when we have caregivers that aren't responsive for whatever reasons, they have mental illness, they're taking care of a sick child, they're not able to, they don't have the money, whatever those reasons are, that the world ends up not feeling like a safe place where our needs don't get met because nobody's responding to them. So when we grow up and have secure attachments, we kind of go through the world feeling like the world's a pretty safe place. I can have needs, they're going to get met. But when, especially for HSPs who grew up in environments where there wasn't a tuned caregiver or an HSP caregiver, we kind of learn that our feelings can't be trusted. We're told to not have these feelings. We're not being responded to in a way that makes us feel safe and secure. So then we don't know that we're okay. We don't know that the world is a safe place. I know I put you on the spot asking you this question, so I'm not trying to overrun what you said, but do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, thank you. That was a more concise way to say it, and also brings it into adulthood and how it affects our adult relationship.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have trouble being concise. So that's super helpful. And I think the word security and safety, we want to feel safe. We want to get our needs met, their basic needs. And so kind of to go back to the idea that we're wired for survival. When someone's not meeting our needs, we need to figure out how to survive. When we go into survival mode, all systems that are unnecessary for survival shut down. So that is the system that connects us to other people. And that's like our prefrontal cortex, to get technical, but I know that can get I can nerd out on that. So I'll try not to. So things unnecessary for survival shut down. And so it's just a reptilian brain, the most primitive part of who we are. And so it's fight or flight or freeze. And so how this could show up with people who weren't sure if they were safe or not, their needs were going to get met, and they don't feel that, there's a freeze, there's a flight, which is go away, self-protect. So that's like how if we don't get that survival need met for connection, then the other side of survival comes in to help protect ourselves. Does that make sense?
It does. Can you break this down into like a specific person of what this would look like? Because I know we're talking theory and we have to talk theory, but I always love when we can make it about a real person.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times in relationships, we don't feel safe when there's a disagreement or a conflict. Let's say you are going to go shopping for the holiday season and you and your partner have an agreement about a certain budget and you blow the budget and your partner comes home and you have a conversation about it and your partner has a very scary response to you. Like he or she is angry, upset. The way that you learn to survive, probably as a child, whatever you did is probably going to show up. You may freeze, you may shut down, you may go away, just say, I need to leave the room. I can't deal with this. So you're going to have the type of responses that we talked about in that situation, encountering conflict and maybe not feeling super safe.
Okay, that was a great example. I want to dial back to Brene Brown's initial work because I had interrupted you when we talked about attachment. And so can you just kind of summarize again about how we're wired for survival and how trauma impacts that?
Sure. So again, we want connection. We want those secure attachments to feel safe in our relationships. And what gets in the way is the feeling of shame. And shame, Brene's work is about shame and vulnerability. And when we're in that time and space where there's a question if our needs going to get met and it doesn't, as children, as people, we make it about us. I'm not worthy of this thing that I need. I'm not good enough. I'm not a good enough partner to be able to get through this conversation or get this need met. And so that the shame is what shuts us down. And that's where wounding happens. When we feel that we don't belong, there's that it goes with that attachment. And so we'll retreat. We'll start to self-protect.
Perfect. Are you familiar with Alice Miller's book, The Drama of the Gifted Child?
I am, and I have started it and I've not finished it. I'm a book junkie, so I kind of forget a lot.
Oh my gosh, tell me about it. I have 5 books on my nightstand and I can't tell you how many books on my Kindle. Some of them started, some of them not, but we digress. This is the same thing. And I think truths are universal and it just depends on who says it. But what happens is as kids, our survival depends on our caregivers. And so if our caregivers aren't meeting our needs, we can't as kids go, you're having a deficit right now. You're not meeting my needs. So the kid makes it all about themselves. And that's where the shame starts from. And then we take that shame. And as we grow up, we have these defense mechanisms, like the example that you gave about the person doing some holiday shopping and overspending and then their partner getting angry. It triggers a shame spiral. And so like you said, we either get angry and we leave or we shut down or we just use those defense mechanisms. So where's a good place to go from here?
Absolutely. I think that you can read so many different people and theorists, and a lot of things circle back to the same thing. How we figure out how to survive, how we figure out how to get our needs met. And I think that showing up in your adult relationships, whatever happened to you in childhood and the beliefs that you formed about yourself as a response to what happened in those shaming moments growing up is going to show up in your adult relationships too. And so that is where people start to realize about childhood emotional neglect. They may end up with some couples work going on, or they're realizing they're not connecting in their relationships, even socially. So people start to recognize something isn't right. This isn't working for me, or I don't feel safe. I have anxiety and I'm not sure what to do about it.
Right. So can we look a little bit about childhood emotional neglect and trauma with a little t and what that looks like and how it relates to this?
Sure. So Dr. Janice Webb, it's her research, and it means that she talks about how the neglect is things that didn't happen. And so it's not something that you can point to. But in my real life experience, people with CEN also have little t trauma, which is you may have fallen off your bike and gotten really hurt. And your parent was like, oh, you're fine, get up, like, stop crying, don't be a baby. And that seems very dismissive, forgettable to some people. But to HSPs and more sensitive children, if that's a pattern, it's a trauma, but it's also neglecting to soothe the child. But it's also this dismissiveness, like, what's wrong with you? Why do you fall? Or why do you need me? Like, just get up, don't be a baby. So this criticism, like, there's something wrong with you for needing that soothing.
Yep. Yep. And it sounds like it's such a minor example, but then the message that the kid gets is my feelings aren't okay. How I respond isn't okay. How I relate in the world is not okay. There's something wrong with me. And that gets internalized and carried forward. And it's so pervasive. And I don't even know how to communicate how such a minor incident with a caregiver can translate into such deep wounding as an adult.
Absolutely. Yes. And I can imagine some people who are parents might be, oh my gosh, what am I doing to my children? And I think that we're all human and we're imperfect. And what is great about kids is that they're also resilient. And so if you have a moment as a parent where you're like, oh, I didn't mean to be dismissive or whatever, and you know that your child is sensitive, you can always go back and take accountability and apologize. And that actually builds trust. And, we're going to get into that later. But yes, those small moments of just not getting your needs met and getting soothed, like you were saying, and those beliefs that you start to take on about yourself and how people respond to you in the world, when those add up, so all those small T's over time can really solidify those beliefs about yourself.
Yep. And they're not even conscious. I think that's the thing that's so challenging, is that it's not even conscious. So we don't even know that it's going on. And it's like building this, it's not a wall, but it's like layer on layer on layer on layer of every time we have a need or a feeling that doesn't get met in a way that makes us feel seen and heard and valued. It's a little chip in us. And one more time that we feel like how we're showing up in the world is not okay. And none of this is conscious.
You took the words out of my mouth. We all just want to be seen. We want to be seen. And so then our needs can get met. And absolutely, it isn't conscious, but that's how it also shows up in our adult relationships. We want to be seen. We want to be known. We want to be accepted for that. And it sounds so easy to say, but it can be really, really difficult if you've had these woundings, if you've had CEN, if you have some shame stories and things that have happened, it can be very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I recall realizing about myself, because I'm always trying to understand what's going on with me, when I became an adult, I use the analogy of Swiss cheese. I felt like parts of me were incredibly well developed and very solid. So that would be the cheese part of the cheese. And then there were other parts where we talk about, the shame or the trauma, where it's like, I just was missing entire chunks of skill sets. So, in the place where Swiss cheese has all these big holes in it, I think that in my mind, can be how childhood emotional neglect shows up. This is how I make sense of things. There's nothing research-based about this. This is all anecdotal, but I think that's really common, that areas where our parents were able to be really solid and give us certain skills, there are parts of our development that are really solid. And then the other areas where it's like, we just got out of line and didn't get a whole handful of skill sets a number of times.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think that sometimes we're blind to where the holes in the cheese are, and we don't recognize it until something happens and we realize that didn't go the way I wanted it to, or I'm embarrassed that this was my reaction. As an example, I went to a really competitive school, totally caught up in who can get into the best college, and, just very, very competitive. And that just fueled the fire of perfectionism and always having to be better, don't make mistakes, things like that. So, did fine, got into a great school. Okay, whatever. But in one of my first jobs, I had this amazing performance review, and there was one negative thing. And I remember getting the fight or flight response in that room with my boss and feeling so ashamed that there was something bad on that. But they kind of have to put something bad on there, so there's something to improve on. That was kind of my recognition that there's a hole in my cheese, and I know it's okay to, not be perfect, but there's still, I felt ashamed that there was something that was perceived as not good enough, and it just pushed that button. And that was when I recognized, I think I need to work on accepting feedback.
Yeah. I think that we tend to think in extremes that everything is all good or all bad as opposed to that gray area. And this is what I love about Brene Brown's work about, shame can't live in secrecy, so that when we have those feelings of inadequacy or not enoughness, when we're able to talk about it and shine light on the shame, it creates room for growth and change.
Absolutely. She says that shame grows with secrecy, silence, and judgment. And the antidote to that is empathy. And we get empathy through relationships and connection. And that's what we're talking about, right? Shame pulls us away. We want to just go to kind of climb into a hole and never come out to survive. But empathy is what we get from other people. You can say, oh, that happened to me too. This is something that you're not alone in. I understand how that feels. Empathy is what can really take away the shame and help us be shame resilient, because it's a myth. Like people say, oh, you have to be fearless. Like that's actually not possible, because fear helps us know what's safe and not safe. That's primitive. We have to know that. So we're going to have shame. It's just going to happen. But being resilient and knowing the shame triggers, like knowing where your holes may be, helps you respond much faster and recover much faster.
I love that. So let's talk about shame triggers and how, when we get triggered, how we can work with that to figure out where the wounding is and what we need to do to start working through that.
Shame triggers can be anything. A lot of people feel triggered when they're judged. A lot of people feel triggered when there's a boundary violation. A boundary is what's okay and what's not okay. That could be a boundary around time, someone being late and not accountable to that. That could be a physical boundary, with intimacy. A trigger could be anything, but shame is a full body experience. So a lot of times your body will tell you something's going on before your head can catch up. So I know I'm in fight or flight, shame mode when I feel hot, my heart's racing, I tense up, and then I'll start to shut down. So there's this physical awareness that's really important to understanding that you've been triggered. And so it's important for people to start to recognize those emotions in their body. And that is part of recovering from CEN as well. And it's a lot of times part of any therapy that people are in, is understanding their emotions, how they feel them in their body, and then what to do. So the first thing to do when feeling the shame is to immediately start breathing. Breathing helps our nervous system calm down, helps the parasympathetic nervous system engage to bring us out of that fight or flight, to give us time and space from reacting in the moment. So breathing is, it sounds so simple. A great thing is box breathing. So you're just going to imagine a box, and you're going to inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, exhale for 4, and hold for 4. And I have clients, if they take nothing else away, they do box breathing and they rave about it. It's so effective. And you don't just do one box, you have to do several, just keep breathing. And that's going to help your thinking brain get back online so you can decide what you want to do.
I worked in a hospital for 9 years, and as much as I used breathing with people, I had somebody come into the ER one day, and when we talked about breathing, I loved what she said, and she had learned this in her program. What she said is smell the roses, so breathe in through your nose, blow out the candles. So when you exhale, you want to use kind of a pursed lip so that, you're exhaling. So when you're doing your box breathing, smell the roses, blow out the candles.
Oh, awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
Going back to when we get triggered, let's go back to the example about the holiday overspending.
Okay.
I'm just going to say it's me. My husband is super disappointed. When someone's disappointed in me, that's a huge shame trigger, like monumental. And that's for a lot of people as well.
Yeah.
I know my heart races. I feel like almost like my body's vibrating. I start to breathe. And then Brene Brown talks about the stories we make up about what's happening. A phrase that it comes from her work is, I would say, so the story I'm making up about this is that, I've tanked our budget and you're really mad at me. And I'm not thinking of a good story, but it's usually a really negative thing. Like basically I'm an awful person. The story I'm making up is that people are now going to think that if we have to return it, that we're not generous, assumptions, the automatic beliefs that, CBT, the automatic thoughts that come up with that.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say the story I'm making up, when you're in a conflict with another person, it helps them not get defensive, and you can own like where your thoughts are and say, so what's actually happening for you? Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
And checking in with them, that slows everything down, and you can do a reality check. And they might say, well, I mean, I'm frustrated, but you're not a bad person. Like, let's just figure it out together, and that might help just diffuse the situation completely. Versus your partner like blowing up and being like, well, I told you this was a budget. You never listen. This is awful. And, kind of goes off the rails from there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we share the story we make up in our head. We get a reality check. We've used breathing to calm down. Are there other techniques to use to soothe when we get into a shame spiral or get triggered?
Breathing is always the first go-to. And then you can go to the story we make up. If you're feeling so activated that you can't speak, like some people, when they freeze, they just completely shut down. You can say, you know what, I'm feeling really flooded with emotion. Can we come back to this in a half an hour? Take a break.
Mm-hmm.
Get some space, but you're giving it a time limit. So you're not running away. You're asking for a break. You can take a break. You can also ask questions. Getting curious is a way to gain understanding before jumping to other conclusions. Asking questions about, well, are you understanding that this was on, Jimmy's Christmas list and this costs this amount of money? How are we going to, get everyone what they need? And this is our budget. Can you help me understand? Getting curious helps also gives the other person time to talk and you to keep breathing, to keep calming your body down.
I love that. Help me understand is one of my favorite phrases, using curiosity for mindfulness and saying, help me understand. I would imagine too that if both people are highly activated, it might be better because when we're activated, we're in our reptile brain. When I talk with clients, I use my little T-Rex forearms to indicate like, this is your amygdala, because that's when we want to get the heck out. We want to fight or we want to just play dead. And so when we're in our little T-Rex brain, we often don't have the ability to do a lot of thinking and rationalizing. So one option may be that one or both people need to take time until they can be calm and sort of be back in their frontal lobe, which is where our reasoning and our logic and being rational is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the final step, comes with more self-knowledge and self-awareness is that I need to be an adult in this exact situation, in this circumstance. But actually, I felt like, that 7-year-old child when I did something wrong that my mom told me not to do and I got yelled at. And so understanding that might be the part of you that feels really ashamed in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's work to do around that. That's where the CEN is. That's where that part of you, you kind of get short circuited there when that gets triggered in the present. You're going to go back to the younger part that also felt that way. So that's not for that moment when you're having the issue about the holiday shopping. That's for later. That's for journaling. That's for therapy. That's for self-reflection and figuring out what you want to do about that. How you want to go about healing.
Mm-hmm. I know for me too, that there are times when I cry and my voice gets very high. I know that that's a wound from childhood when, my voice gets really young and it gets very high, that we're not talking about something that just happened now. We're talking about a really old wound that just got triggered.
Oh, totally. Yeah, people definitely have their signs. I know mine is I just stop talking. I will just stop talking. I won't be able to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then I know I'm pretty triggered.
Yeah. There's something too about, for me, shame that I feel like I've been exposed, that I want to show up in the world looking a certain way. And that when somebody makes a comment on my behavior or something that I've done that I'm not okay with, I have that feeling of being really exposed that, oh no, everybody can see this about me. And here it feels like the emperor has no clothes. Like I'm walking around thinking I've got these beautiful duds on and I'm stark naked and everybody knows it except for me. That for me is sometimes how shame can feel for me. Like everybody can see something about me that I can't.
Sure. And that's how most people conceptualize being vulnerable and why most people want to avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really counterintuitive is that we have to be vulnerable to have the really authentic connections with the people we love and care about that we have to take those risks. We have to be emotionally exposed and walk into the uncertainty of vulnerability in order to get joy and love and connection and belonging. But when we are afraid of those moments where someone could point something out, and you're not expecting it. Oh, I'm vulnerable. I'm going to go into my turtle shell and never come out. That's self-protective, but that also then you miss the opportunity to connect. And if that's habitual, that's why I might see someone show up in my office and say, I can't maintain friendships. I can't connect with my partner. It's because we have this habitual self-protecting, because vulnerability is so scary. And we learned that it's not safe, kind of going back to where we started the conversation, because we didn't get those needs met.
Right. From what we're talking about, it feels like the place where we can share what the story that we're making up in our head is one of the first places where we start to share vulnerably, because it's exposing a little bit of hey, this just happened and this is where my head is taking me. Can we talk about whether this is going on or not?
Perfect. Oh my gosh. That's just ding, ding, ding. Absolutely. Yeah. I love how I'll say something and then you kind of fill in with another perspective on it. And it's just beautiful.
So let's give a couple more examples of something that would happen where we might be making up a story in our head. Anya, do you have an example of what this looks like?
Sure. So I think in our text messaging world, this is super common. We text someone and they don't text back. And we immediately go to making up stories. The story I'm making up is they're mad at me. They hate me. They think this question is dumb. All of these negative ideas about to try to understand why the person's not texting back. And so because it's an assumption, there's a lack of information. So instead of saying, did you get my text? I really need you to respond, or can you, asking more questions or calling the person, we may just react to that story and go from there.
Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great example. Do you have another one?
I think, when I think about my son, he's not even aware this is happening yet, but it's something that we're trying to work on with him. Something happens at school and he's embarrassed and he comes home and he doesn't want to share it because the story he's making up is, I'm going to get in trouble. My parents are going to be disappointed in me. I know I wasn't supposed to do this. And so we try, once he does start to say something about it, try to really gently make room for that and make space for it and validate that we all mess up. And, none of us have great days all the time. And, we want you to be able to come to us. We're not mad at you. Or let's talk about what was going on and how we can make it better for tomorrow. And so even as a parent, looking for those signs where your child, if you might see those stories starting to happen, and, we can't control everything, and our, people have their own innate risk and protective factors, but to the extent that you can forecast what those stories might be, you can try to deactivate them as well, if that makes sense.
Right. I was thinking I had an experience just this week where I had an online meeting with someone that I'm collaborating on a project with. And we had this meeting and I show up on time and she's not there. And this is a real hot spot for me. I have a history of people literally not showing up when they're supposed to. And I do everything I can to be where I'm supposed to be, as close to the time as I'm supposed to be there. I texted her, I messaged her, she didn't show up. And because we're going to be collaborating for a while, I kind of went to this place of, this is not going to be workable for me. I need people I can count on. And this is a really hot trigger for me. But I know enough now to know, let's wait until we get more information. That's my reactivation or that's my activation, but let's hold on till we get some information. And this is a new relationship. So she did show up about 10 minutes late. She apologized. She had something that held her over that totally understandable. And we started talking and it's a new relationship. And I thought, I'm just going to test the waters out here. And I said, I hope you're in a place where you can hear this. I just want to tell you what went on with me because this is a trigger for me. And I'm hoping that the relationship can tolerate it. But if it can't, let's find out now before we're 6 months down the road, heavy into this project. And we find out that, we can't handle conflict. And so I shared with her why it's a hot spot, what went on with me. She was really able to hear it and embrace it. It really ended up creating safety in the relationship because I was willing to be vulnerable with her. It didn't push her buttons. And it it really ended up being a beautiful experience. And so I feel like what we're talking about now is kind of a few steps before this. But I think that this is how we take this information and we move forward to create safety and trust in relationships. And I'm really clear that if you can't hear that and that triggers you, then I don't think we're going to be able to work together, because I've got to be able to talk about things that come up. It doesn't have to do with you, but this is what I get triggered about. And if it happens again, I'm probably going to get triggered and we're going to need to talk about it.
That's such a beautiful example. I love that. And that's when conflict can be helpful, because conflict doesn't have to be yelling. It can say like, this didn't work for me. And, and I hope that you can hear this. Really being gentle in your approach, but also assertive and standing up for yourself and having the self-awareness and self-knowledge that there are some deal breakers for you in relationships and that this need is reasonable. This is something that is, you just need to feel safe and build that trust in a relationship. And so having that need met so beautifully on the other side, that just accelerates your trust and connection. And I think that's so beautiful.
Thanks. And there's so much fear that people have about talking about what's going on. What I hear so much is one person is feeling resentful that there's a dynamic going on in the relationship. But the risk is if you tell the other person, then you lose control because they may get angry. And I think that for many of us that struggle with assertiveness, we'd rather at least have the control and feel resentful than to share and then run the risk that the other person's going to get mad and then we don't have control. So how do we start working through that?
That's a really good question. I think that that's a huge pervasive fear, is making someone else mad, that it's not okay. But the casualty is that you're walking around with this icky, yucky feeling. And so I think it's about working through what is making you angry. What about it's making you angry? And I do a backwards exercise for this. So when there's resentment, it comes from an unmet need, but it's hard to sometimes identify what that need is. And this is actually in an opt-in I made, especially for the HSPs of this podcast, like this technique. So the resentment, identify the resentment. And the resentment comes from an unmet expectation. I had an expectation that this person would show up to this meeting on time. They didn't, and I resent it. This always happens to me, and you go off to the races. So there was an expectation that she'd be on time, and the need is for reliability, right? And so you identifying that as like a basic need for you in your relationships, you can approach someone and say, what's really important to me in relationships is reliability. And this came up as a problem. And I really am hoping you're open to talking about it with me. Because once you take that resentment, like the anger is secondary. What's underneath it is some hurt, usually disappointment. We don't want to carry around that disappointment and resentment because it's toxic to us. If the other person's angry, they're angry. Their feelings are not our responsibility. But the CEN and HSPs and people-pleasing tendencies, we tend to think that other people's emotions are our responsibility, but they're not. And I don't know, they're just, it's just not true. And once people can start to let go of that control and the fear of people being angry with them, it leads to so much more freedom and an authenticity in the relationship.
Yep. And the second part, just going back to kind of the example that we talked about, is then when we know, and I love that I often don't know that I have an expectation or a need until it doesn't get met. And then we go like, I had no idea that was going on. So I love that. And I saw the opt-in that you have. We'll talk about that at the end of the session. I love what you created for the listeners. So thank you very much for that, Anya.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the other part of that is that then when we know that that's a hot spot and it comes up, then what I can share with people is I have lots of grace and room for flexibility. What I need from you is to communicate. If you're going to be late, if you're not going to be able to show up, let me know as soon as you can, because otherwise I get triggered, but I get that stuff comes up. So there are also workarounds that even with our triggers, there are things that we can ask for that are going to help to create some boundaries around that. It doesn't mean we're always going to get what we want, but there's kind of a second part of how we can take care of ourselves around those things.
Totally. And one of the paradoxes of vulnerability is that when we are vulnerable with someone else, it gives them permission to be vulnerable as well. And so taking that risk to show up and be seen by expressing that need in a really respectful way, then it gives that person room to say, thank you so much for letting me know. I had no idea, and I'll do the best I can. Because it's really important to me that, people trust me, that they don't automatically assume if I'm late that it means I don't care, or, that's something I have to work on, look at being on time. Thanks for bringing it to my attention. I really appreciate that. So one person's vulnerability can help make it possible for the other person as well. And that just really enhances the connection of the whole relationship.
Absolutely. I think it's that ability to say, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. This is what's coming up for me. Can we talk about it? Can we work it out? I'm going to do it imperfectly. I think that when we take off that veneer of perfectionism and show up as humans who are fallible and make mistakes, it really creates beautiful opportunities for relationships to have more depth and more honesty.
Totally. And I think that that phrase, I don't know, I don't know right now, I need to think about it, is great, because that's true. It's something I need to figure out, that this gives me an opportunity to grow in that way. It's okay not to have the answers. Absolutely.
Right. So I'm looking at the time, and what I'm thinking is, what we're going to do is we're going to break this episode into 2 episodes. So where we're going to be heading for the second episode is childhood emotional neglect, CEN, and understanding how to build trust and to strengthen connection. Because often what I hear is that people want to trust people, but they feel like they can't because they've been burned so many times. So how do we start to assess whether people are trustworthy? How do we develop trust? How do we work with vulnerability and hurt so that we can create wonderful connections and the relationships that we're really craving?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to talk about that, because that's kind of where we're headed right now. It's like, so how do we know, when we can take that risk to be vulnerable? How do you know that about yourself? And so I'm really excited to get into that.
Yeah. Is there anything that you want to share before we end about this session? And then I'm going to have you tell the listeners about the offer that you have for them.
Sure. I don't think so. I don't think there's anything else I need to add, unless you think there's a loop that we haven't closed.
Well, I'm looking at my notes, and we really didn't talk about how to communicate in the moment that you've been triggered. Well, I guess we did, because we talked about making up the story in your head.
Right. And the breathing and, walking back the resentment to the need, maybe taking a break, asking questions.
Hey, we did it all. Imagine that. Woohoo. Anya, why don't you tell the listeners about the offer that you have for them? Tell people where they can find you, and then we'll wrap up, and then we will get ready to record our second part of this episode.
Sure. So my website is couragecompasstherapy.com, and I created a download for unapologetically sensitive listeners on communication scripts to use in these exact situations, because what I find with my clients is that it's like, okay, I get that. I understand why I need to use that skill, but I don't know the literal words to say. When we haven't practiced that, when that hasn't been modeled to us, like, can you please just tell me what words to use? And so I have some sentence completion exercises, like the expectation, the resentment, expectation, need exercises in there. So if you want to take what we've talked about and apply it to your life, these are some ways to get started on that. And it's couragecompasstherapy.com/HSP.
Excellent. And I will have all of this in the show notes. Apple iTunes has made some changes. So if you want to get copies of the show notes, if you're listening on a podcast player that doesn't have them, you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com, click on the episode that you're interested in, and that will take you to a page that has all the show notes and the resources and the link to Anya's offer for you amazing listeners. All right. Is there anything else before we go, Anya?
That is it. I'm good.
All right. Thank you so much for being here today. I cannot wait to start our second talk.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for being here today and listening. I hope you got a lot out of this episode. I'm really looking forward to the next episode where we continue this conversation. If any of this is resonating with you and you're finding that it's hard to have vulnerability in your relationships, you have a hard time with trust, you have triggers, you're having shame, this is the stuff I love working with. If you live in California, we can do an online consultation for free, and I provide therapy. So this is the stuff I love talking about. If you're interested, you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com. My contact information is there. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, I would love to hear from you. We have an amazing Facebook group called Unapologetically Sensitive. You just have to hop on over and answer a couple of short questions. If you're enjoying this show, you can really help me out by rating and reviewing the podcast. It helps other people find this podcast. We're growing really quickly, and I would love to get this podcast out to as many people as possible. So if you know someone who might be interested in it, please tell them about it. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.